because when it comes down to it, the only person who's going to spend time throughout your life with you is you. So if you're not able to kind of look at and address the things that are going on in your body, which is your mind as well, it's your brain and what it's telling you and what it's um, showing you about yourself. But if you avoid that and just wait for external support or external validation, and I don't think these are bad things, but if you start and only live for those as opposed to saying, you know what, let me start from within. Let me look at this person I am and what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, why I'm not doing it, who I'm with, who I choose to spend time with, what I'm applying and asking myself. And if you don't start from there, but only kind of go from one concept to another concept, because that's what externally people are identifying you as, I feel the shell is going to crack, and you're going to get more and more hesitant to kind of look within that shell because it gets harder to look at. And this is not to
Hmm.
preach or patronize anyone. I just think it's a very difficult thing to look at um, yourself naked with all the strengths and all the weaknesses and all the decisions and the quote unquote regrets, because I don't think regrets are necessarily in your control, right? Because that means going back and undoing, but you can't. And I just think these are such important tools for yourself and for your journey on life. Because when you just mentioned radical candor, it's a way of kindness and loving yourself in the workplace. And I think when you look at the workplace now, and I'm not a professional working in a corporate, and I did that for maybe a year or two, so I don't want to kind of put everything into my own perception of those 2 years. But when you look at the labels used in a corporate setting, like competitiveness, performance, and
Hmm.
going climbing up the corporate ladder and the hierarchy, and there's one first thing is that I think there's the sense that my situation, like I can sit here saying, I'm visually impaired. I've got a genetically mutated retina, which is causing me a form of blindness, which is progressively getting worse. And that is way worse than someone who's got an autoimmune disorder. Like it's so easy to scoff at someone, and when it's just a
Hmm.
label, we're encouraged to do that, saying like my problem is bigger than yours. But in reality, no, because you finding energy to do what you want is as important to you as for me to trying to find a way to use the other senses I have to kind of to live a life that I want to live. So if you externally start measuring everyone's problems, then it becomes a pecking order, right? But if we're able to look at our own situation with all its the weighing scale, I think then I think I don't have a question, but I just feel that's a great place to start with.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate it. I've been doing a lot of training recently where I've been training kind of trainers in other companies so they can roll out radical candor. In one of the sessions, someone shared something that really resonated with me, which is that we are we are all sort of the heroes of our own stories, but we tend to look at other people, especially if we're in conflict or having a difficult conversation with them. We tend to think of them as the villain in our story. But the
Mm,
reality is they're just the hero in their own story, right? And so even this idea uh, of the human nature of constant comparison and which again I think it is human nature, and so not to beat ourselves up for doing that, but noticing like, oh, anytime I might feel frustrated by someone or some action, like I really do try to look at that. What is it about that is bothering me? What are the parts that's something that I do? This idea of like, if you spot it, you got it, as is, sort of a self-help phrase. But I think there's some element of those things where they can become almost markers for us of either things that we value. It's like, oh, something is going against my value. That's why my values, that's why it's bumping up for me, or it's actually something that I do, and it's sort of easier to notice it
mm,
in someone else. And just to, in terms of what we do at Radical Candor, one of the things I really appreciate most is that So it's this idea of, can I build relationships at work with people where I'm caring about them? I'm seeing them as, a real human being that I want to build a relationship with. And I'm also willing to challenge them directly. And one of the things that we do is look up, even in just one conversation, the ways in which we might make mistakes. So maybe we're challenging someone, but we're not caring. And we call that uh, acting obnoxiously aggressive. You're sort of acting like a jerk. And it can
Mm,
be very easy to think about putting people in boxes, like sort of these as almost a personality test, like, oh, this person's a jerk and this person's always so nice and they never, but these are behaviors and these are tendencies that we have. And so I find that model very empowering because it's very focused not on sort of intrinsic personality, but really on specific behaviors that we can do. Oh, I need to be more kind with this person, or oh, I need to be more clear. And so it's like it's good writing, good storytelling. If you just go on stage and do stand up and say, there was this guy and he was really funny and he liked this girl, like nobody cares. But starting to get specific, that's how we tell stories. And that's actually how we can take the feedback that we might be giving and receiving, both praise and criticism, in a way when it's specific, it's sincere, it's kind, it's clear. That is really what we're talking about. And I
mm.
can go into more detail, but I will say that one of the biggest shifts and teaching radical candor, all over the world to all different types of companies, is that it's based on a shift from these sort of top-down command and control companies to collaboration, to this idea that, telling people what to do doesn't work. And it's very interesting because, depending on what culture you were raised in, depending on, what generation you're coming from, like that is a shift. When I was in business school and just starting out, it was like their workplace was very hierarchical, and and this is very much based on humility and leadership, on vulnerability, on compassion. And so that's where I do feel quite optimistic that these are ideas that 25 years ago wouldn't have been successful in the workplace. It doesn't mean there's not still a lot of top down behavior, but I think there's, especially when we look at younger generations and where they want to go, people want to be seen as full human beings.
Yeah, because this, India over the past 15 years has just really grown with entrepreneurs, with startups, with some
Hmm.
companies that have really, you know, gone global and have set benchmarks for it, foreign investment. And there are a lot of people who are noticing India. And now that's where I live in Bangalore has become a hub for venture capitalists. And a lot of
Hmm.
people are, flocking here for work. And this started in 2000s with the entire outsourcing boom and jobs coming here. A lot of people from different parts of India coming here now, even from different parts of the world. And you hear these stories, right, of people who started off with an idea. You hear words like they were bootstrapped, or they got seed funding, and then they just took off. And I'm not a business person, so I might butcher these terms or the understanding of these terms. But as a person who likes to observe human beings, you see the story where they, typically started out of college, they were dropouts, and you hear these themes in many many examples. And then they get to a place where they're valued at $1 billion, or they got acquired for millions. And then you look at these people in the interviews. There's a sense of a whatever this person is, and whichever you know corporate they're in, or whichever line of work, whether it's tech or healthcare, or whether it's hospitality or food. There's a sense of power which comes with a business. And whether it's at a managerial level, at a CEO level, whether it's within a team, whether it's within between teams, how do you address that with kindness and humility? Because intrinsically there is a need for power, whether it's uh, gender related, whether it's socially, whether it's
Hmm.
um, in this case professionally, because that's something that has driven us for years. And while it's the salaries and the packages, you see, now when I do some shows, or did some shows with the corporates, you have this pecking order, which is I don't know if it's
Yeah.
unconscious, but when you go there, and if you go directly, and if I don't And there's something from day one I've been trying to do is I sit in the front while the show's going on before I have to get on stage, because when the talks are going, because otherwise you're relegated to be backstage, just given a bottle of water if you're lucky. And it's like, no, no, you can't be seen until you have to get on stage. I'm like, no, I'm as much a part of this. I'm not going to interrupt the program, but I'm going to sit here and be a part of it so I can get the energy of the room. But there's this thing that you know when I go talk to whoever it is, but I don't know if they're the CEO. And I think in some way this is where the eye condition comes in. I can't tell who the most um, senior figure is based on looks, but I can, for me, energy is very important. So I'll
Yeah.
talk to the bartender at the room. I'll also talk to the CEO in the same context, in the same tone, because for me, human beings are human beings. But not everyone does that because, my God, you know who you were talking to? That guy was the CEO. I'm like, oh, really? Okay, cool. But there is this power game floating around in that room of who you're seen
Yes.
with and who you should be talking. So how do you um sorry, I went around the world to come back to,
No,
to
no, no.
ask you this question, but
I
I just wanted to create this understanding in my own head of, we say these things like being humble, vulnerable, opening up to your colleagues, and being kind, but isn't that a sure shot way of um, being pushed down and someone else using that as a leverage to climb up over you?
it's a really great question. And I did actually do a session before the pandemic in Bangalore. It was my first time going to India, so I know some of that kind of entrepreneurial spirit you're referring to. Power is a big part of why. So Kim Scott wrote the book Radical Candor. She had been at Google and at Twitter. We actually went to business school together, although I didn't know her at the time.
Hmm.
And the the focus of the book was was really for bosses, for managers, how managers can actually kind of lay their power down in many ways to counteract and lead great teams. So the book itself is really focused on like a new management philosophy that you don't actually have to be a jerk and power hungry to succeed. In fact, it's the opposite. But what makes radical candor radical is that it's rare that we're both compassionate and candid. And so, one of the things that we'll do in our workshops is go through what we would call an order of operations. And I'll say that the model holds for everyone. I do a lot of work with individual contributors all the way up to CEOs. And one of the things that I think is really interesting when it comes to power and this idea of humble and humility is it really depends on uh, where you are sort of systemically when you look at that word. If you are, a CEO, probably a white man in your 50s or 60s, you probably have a lot of systemic as well as hierarchical power. It's really important for you to lay that power down. If you're an individual contributor, person of color, woman, someone with a disability, et cetera, you're in your early 20s, you know, uh, sometimes being humble can actually sound like humiliating yourself. And that's not
Mm,
what we're talking about. And so I think those are very interesting words and phrases. And so when it comes to this order of operations, what do I mean by lay your power down? Well, specifically when it comes to feedback, to giving and receiving feedback, we really want, especially managers, especially leaders, but anyone with some sort of power, whether it's hierarchical or even just in a system where certain groups might have more power than others, uh, that one of the best ways to actually lay your power down is actually by asking for feedback. And it seems counterintuitive. You think about, oh, feedback is really a boss giving direct reports criticism. Well, no, in fact, you want to be asking for feedback. So, for example, if I was a CEO and you were going to be going on stage, I would want to ask you, I'm going to be introducing you, Soapy. Like, what's one way that I can set you up for success, right when you're going on stage, something like that. How can
mm,
I support? How can I support you? Also, when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, how can you be an ally? How can you actually say the thing if you do have some power that would be hard for someone else? Now, what's really interesting with radical candor, this idea of being kind and clear, what makes it radical is that it's so rare. unfortunately, people kind of misinterpreted the phrase radical candor as license or excuse to just say whatever the heck you want. Oh, I'm just being radically candid. There's usually, air quotes there where you're just saying, that was the dumbest thing I've ever heard. That's a terrible idea. No, that is not the spirit of radical candor. That is the spirit of obnoxious aggression. And so when we actually came out with the second edition of the book, we reframed it. It's compassionate candor.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
what makes it radical is that it's rare. It's, we tend to think at work we either have to be really, really, nice and kind and just focus on the human part and care, or we just have to be so direct. It's rare that we're doing both, and that's really what we're focused on. Is that no, in fact, the best relationships happen when we are doing both. We're telling the person the thing they need to know. You can build trust and psychological safety. And I'll just tell like a sort of quick example. We did a partnership with Second City. You might know Second City. They're an improv group in the
Mm-hmm.
US and Canada, improvisation. And we were just about to go on stage, and uh, one of the improvisers, a man, came out of the restroom, and his zipper, his fly was down. And
Mm-hmm.
my first reaction was, well, who's going to tell this guy that his fly is down? Like, he can't go on stage looking like that. And I'm, looking around, someone's going to, it's like, Amy, you are literally the only person between him and going on stage. And by the way, you're teaching radical candor. So you need to tell him. So I pulled him to the side. I told him he was an improviser. So of course he was funny about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason I share that as a story is I teach this to hold myself accountable to doing it. It's so easy to think, oh, they're smart, they'll figure out they're making this mistake, or oh, someone else is gonna do it. We sort of don't think about the actions. And you probably have done something like this, but before we would go on stage with improv, we always say, and we do this before our podcast, we say to each other, got your back.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's what I mean by psychological safety and trust. I can trust that if I'm working on a team, if I'm messing up, someone is going to tell me. They're going to do it in a way that's kind and clear. They're also going to tell me, maybe even more important, what I'm doing well. Praise, specific, not BS praise, like, Amy, you're so smart, but specific and sincere praise.
Mm-hmm.
So we know more to do the good stuff. And so, that's just an example of, telling someone privately, doing it immediately. And that builds trust, right? Because now
Yeah.
you're on stage knowing that, gosh, if I was doing something embarrassing, I know that Amy's got my back.